They called me paranoid when I suggested we needed more than granola bars and bottled water for our family emergency kit. They rolled their eyes when I mentioned evacuation routes and communication protocols. They laughed when I tried to explain why their flashlight battery should be stored separately and rotated every 6 months. But when that FEMA representative walked into our community center and announced Major Davis, disaster response expert, while looking directly at me, suddenly everyone stopped laughing. What happened next would change everything my family thought they knew about their quiet, overly cautious sister who worked part-time at the local library and seemed to worry too much about things that would probably never happen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The community center smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, that particular combination of scents that seemed to exist only in public buildings built sometime in the 1970s. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows faced a makeshift podium where my brother-in-law Marcus stood shuffling through printouts he'd clearly grabbed from the internet 15 minutes before the meeting started. The Henderson Family Emergency Preparedness meeting, as he'd grandly titled it in his group text, was supposed to bring together 3 generations of our extended family to finally create a comprehensive disaster plan for our corner of Cedar Falls, Oregon. I sat in the back row, a spiral notebook balanced on my knees, watching my relatives filter in with the casual enthusiasm of people attending a potluck dinner rather than a potentially life-saving planning session. My sister Janet clutched a travel mug of wine disguised as coffee, while their teenage twins, Ashley and Brandon, slumped into chairs with the resigned expression of kids who'd rather be literally anywhere else. Uncle Pete and Aunt Caroline arrived with a bag of chips and a 2-liter of Sprite, apparently having missed the memo that this wasn't a party. Even my elderly parents had shown up, my mother armed with a legal pad and the determined expression she usually reserved for planning church fundraisers. "All right, everyone, settle down," Marcus called out, tapping a pen against his clipboard like a substitute teacher trying to control a classroom. "Thanks for coming out tonight. As you all know, Oregon's been getting more earthquake warnings lately, and with fire season getting worse every year, Janet and I figured it was time we got serious about emergency preparedness as a family." I felt a familiar knot forming my stomach, the same one that always appeared when I watched people approach disaster planning with the casual confidence of someone who'd never actually lived through a real emergency. My pen hovered over my notebook, where I'd already started outlining the topics we actually needed to cover. Water storage calculations based on family size and medical needs, backup power solutions, medical supply inventories, communication trees that accounted for cell tower failures, and evacuation routes that considered seasonal road conditions and traffic patterns. "So I've put together this presentation," Marcus continued, clicking through slides on his laptop that were clearly borrowed from a basic Red Cross website. "First, let's talk about the basics. Food, water, first aid kit. Everyone should have 3 days' worth of supplies." I couldn't help myself. 3 days isn't enough," I said quietly, looking up from my notes. The room turned to look at me with the patient expressions family members reserve for their slightly eccentric relatives. Marcus paused mid-sentence, that slight smile on his face that I'd learned to recognize as his way of managing what he considered my excessive anxiety about things that would probably never happen. "Well, Sarah," he said with the tone of someone speaking to a child, "the official recommendation is 72 hours. That's what all the experts say. The experts assume that help will arrive in 72 hours, but after a major earthquake, especially if it damages transportation infrastructure, you could be looking at weeks before normal services are restored. The Cascadia subduction zone is overdue for a magnitude 9 event that would devastate the entire Pacific Northwest. 3 days of supplies won't get you through the aftermath of something like that." Uncle Pete chuckled, shaking his head. "Sarah, you've been reading too many of those doom and gloom websites again. This isn't the apocalypse, honey. We're talking about being ready for a power outage, or maybe a small earthquake." The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to stay calm. I'm not talking about the apocalypse. I'm talking about realistic disaster scenarios that emergency management professionals plan for every day. When Hurricane Katrina hit, people were stranded for weeks. When the Tohoku earthquake hit Japan, entire communities were cut off from outside help for extended periods. These aren't theoretical scenarios. They're documented disasters that show us what happens when infrastructure fails. My mother reached over and patted my arm with the gentle, slightly worried expression she'd been giving me since I was 12 years old and started reading her medical journals. "Sweetheart, we appreciate your research, but maybe we should focus on simple, practical steps that everyone can actually implement." I looked around the room at my family, these people I loved who had no idea that their overly anxious relative had spent the last 15 years of her life specializing in exactly what they were trying to plan for tonight. They saw Sarah the librarian, Sarah the woman who lived alone with her cat and grew tomatoes in carefully labeled containers. Sarah who always brought extra batteries to family camping trips and insisted on checking weather reports before anyone would listen. They didn't see Major Sarah Davis, the woman who'd coordinated disaster response operations across 3 continents, who'd set up emergency shelters in earthquake zones and flood areas, who's written evacuation protocols that had saved thousands of lives. They didn't know about the sleepless nights I'd spent in command tents, making decisions that meant the difference between communities surviving or being completely overwhelmed by catastrophe. "Okay, moving on," Marcus continued, clicking to his next slide. "Let's talk about communication. Everyone should have each other's phone numbers programmed into their phones." "Cell towers fail," I said, not looking up from my notes, where I was sketching out the family's actual communication needs. "You need backup communication methods, ham radio, satellite communicators, predetermined meeting points with specific protocols from when primary locations become inaccessible." Ashley, my 16-year-old niece, looked up from her phone for the first time since arriving. "Aunt Sarah, ham radio? Seriously? This isn't the 1950s. Ham radio networks remain operational when everything else fails. During Hurricane Maria, when Puerto Rico lost 95% of its cell coverage, amateur radio operators were the primary communication link between isolated communities and emergency services. Modern disaster response relies heavily on ham radio because it's decentralized and doesn't depend on infrastructure that can be damaged." Brandon, her twin brother, rolled his eyes. "Aunt Sarah, you're being paranoid again. We have the internet. We have cell phones. Why would we need to learn some ancient radio technology?" The familiar weight settled on my chest, the weight of knowledge that no one wanted to hear. I'd learned long ago that expertise made people uncomfortable when it forced them to confront the fragility of the systems they took for granted. It was easier to dismiss the messenger than to acknowledge that modern life was more vulnerable than most people want to believe. "Because," I said quietly, "when the Loma Prieta earthquake hit San Francisco in 1989, the only communication that worked reliably was amateur radio. When the World Trade Center was attacked, ham radio operators provided critical communication when commercial systems were overwhelmed. When wildfires hit Sonoma County, amateur radio networks coordinated evacuations while cell towers were either destroyed or overloaded." Marcus looked uncomfortable now, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Okay, well, maybe that's something to consider down the road. But for now, let's focus on the basics that everyone can handle." The dismissal stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent my entire adult life developing expertise in exactly what they were trying to plan for tonight, but because I'd never explicitly told them about my career, my knowledge was treated as the hobby of someone who read too many preparedness blogs and watched too many disaster movies. "What about water storage?" I asked, trying a different approach. "How much water has everyone calculated for their family size?" "A gallon per person per day," Janet said, confidently, clearly proud that she'd remembered this from Marcus's presentation.
"For drinking only," I corrected. "That doesn't account for cooking, cleaning, sanitation, or medical needs. You need closer to 3 to 5 gallons per person per day for actual survival, and that assumes you're rationing carefully. If anyone in your family takes medications that require additional hydration, has medical conditions that increase fluid needs, or if you have pets, your requirements go up significantly." Uncle Pete was looking at me now with that expression I'd seen too many times, the look of someone who was beginning to suspect that their relative was sliding into obsessive territory. "Sarah, honey, where are you getting these numbers? Are you sure you're not overthinking this?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because I couldn't answer it honestly without revealing everything I'd spent years keeping private. How could I explain that I knew these numbers because I'd calculated water requirements for refugee camps and emergency shelters, that I'd seen what happened to communities when their water systems failed and they hadn't prepared for the reality of human needs under disaster conditions? "I've done a lot of research," I said instead, the understatement feeling hollow in my mouth. My mother was looking at me with that particular worried expression she reserved for what she considered my more extreme moments. "Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to Dr. Peterson about your anxiety levels. This level of worry about disasters isn't healthy." The suggestion that my expertise was actually anxiety hit like a slap. I'd heard variations of this my entire adult life, the implication that knowledge about disaster preparedness was somehow pathological, that understanding the real risks we faced was a sign of mental illness rather than professional competence. "I'm not anxious," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "I'm informed. There's a difference between anxiety and understanding risk assessment." But I could see it in their faces, the look that said they were all thinking the same thing. Poor Sarah, always worrying about things that would never happen, always trying to control every possible outcome because she couldn't handle the uncertainty of normal life. Marcus clicked to his next slide, clearly eager to move past what he probably saw as one of my episodes. "Okay, let's talk about evacuation planning. Everyone should know the route out of town in case we need to leave quickly." "Which route?" I asked. "Highway 18 floods during heavy rainfall and becomes impassable. The bridge on Cedar Creek Road has a weight limit that emergency vehicles exceed, so if there's a mass evacuation, it'll be closed to civilian traffic. Route 34 goes through a landslide zone that becomes unstable during seismic events. You need multiple routes mapped out with seasonal considerations and alternative options for different types of disasters." The room was quiet now, everyone staring at me with expressions that ranged from surprise to concern. I realized I'd let too much knowledge slip out, revealed too much familiarity with the technical aspects of evacuation planning. "How do you know all that?" Ashley asked, her teenage skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. I felt heat creep up my neck as I scrambled for an explanation that wouldn't require revealing the truth about my background. "I've lived here a long time. I pay attention to infrastructure." It wasn't technically a lie, but it felt like one. The truth was that I knew these details because I'd conducted evacuation assessments for dozens of communities, because I'd studied the geological and meteorological factors that made Cedar Falls vulnerable, because analyzing evacuation routes was literally part of my job description when I was still active duty. Aunt Caroline was frowning now, the kind of deep, thoughtful frown that meant she was trying to piece something together. "Sarah, you seem to know an awful lot about disaster response for someone who works at the library." The observation hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my carefully constructed civilian identity starting to crack around the edges. I'd worked so hard to separate my professional life from my family life, to be just Sarah the librarian when I was home, to leave Major Davis behind when I walked through my parents' front door. "I read a lot," I said weakly, knowing it sounded inadequate even as the words left my mouth. "You read about evacuation route weight limits and seismic landslide zones?" Brandon asked, his tone indicating he found this claim dubious. Before I could answer, the lights flickered, once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the community center into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made shadows dance across the walls. "Probably just a transformer," Marcus said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I was already moving, my body responding to crisis with the automatic efficiency of years of training. My phone was in my hand, checking for signal, while my eyes scanned the room for exits and potential hazards. The emergency lighting revealed that most of my family was sitting frozen in their chairs, unsure how to respond to this minor disruption of normal life. "Everyone stay calm," I said, my voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise them. "Keep your phones off unless you need them for emergencies. We need to conserve battery life in case this lasts longer than expected." "It's just a power outage, Sarah," Uncle Pete said, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert, and I felt my stomach drop as I read the message. Seismic activity detected, magnitude 6.2, earthquake epicenter 45 miles southeast of Cedar Falls. Aftershocks expected. Remain alert for emergency instructions. The room erupted in confused chatter as everyone's phones started buzzing with the same alert. I watched my family's faces change as they processed the information, watched the casual confidence of people who'd never experienced a real emergency shift into something approaching concern. 6.2, my father said, reading from his phone. "That's not too big, right?" "It's significant," I replied, already running calculations in my head about potential impacts. Depending on the depth and local geology, we could see structural damage, utility failures, transportation disruptions. The earthquake itself isn't the main concern, it's the cascading effects on infrastructure systems. As if summoned by my words, a distant rumble began to grow louder, the sound of heavy vehicles moving fast on the highway outside. Through the emergency lighting's red glow, I could see headlights streaming past the community center windows, more vehicles than should be on rural highways at this time of night. "What's that?" Janet asked, her voice tight with growing anxiety. I moved to the window, my training kicking in as I assessed what I was seeing. The traffic wasn't random, it was organized, purposeful. Government vehicles mixed with emergency services, moving in convoy formation towards something that required a coordinated response. "That's a mobilization," I said, not realizing I'd spoken the thought out loud until I heard the sharp intake of breath behind me. "A what?" Marcus asked. I turned to find my entire family staring at me, their faces illuminated by the red emergency lighting and the glow of their phones.
In their expressions, I could see the moment when their assumptions about who I was began to shift, when the familiar became suddenly unfamiliar. "Emergency services mobilization," I clarified, trying to soften the professional terminology that had slipped out. "It looks like they're responding to something bigger than just a power outage." But even as I said it, I knew this was only the beginning. The earthquake had been felt far enough away that we'd only experienced minor effects here in Cedar Falls, but the convoy of emergency vehicles suggested that somewhere close by, people were dealing with something much worse than flickering lights and confused relatives. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a number I recognized but hadn't seen in months. A number that belonged to my old life, the life my family knew nothing about. I stared at the screen, watching the name flash. FEMA Region X Command. The call could only mean one thing. Whatever was happening, it was big enough that they were activating all available personnel, including reserves like me. The earthquake had triggered something worse, something that would require the expertise I'd spent years hiding from the people I loved most. As the phone continued to ring in my hand, I realized that my carefully maintained civilian identity was about to collide with a reality that wouldn't wait for me to decide whether I was ready to reveal the truth about who I really was. The community center suddenly felt very small, and the weight of my family's confused stares felt heavier than any gear I'd ever carried into a disaster zone. Because whatever was coming, whatever had triggered that convoy of emergency vehicles racing toward the darkness beyond Cedar Falls, it was going to require Major Sarah Davis to step forward. And for the first time in 5 years of carefully constructed civilian life, Sarah the librarian wasn't going to be enough. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Ashley asked, nodding toward my still ringing phone. I looked at my family, at their faces filled with questions I wasn't ready to answer, and realized that the choice was no longer mine to make. The phone kept ringing, carrying with it the weight of everything I'd tried to leave behind and everything I might need to become again. Outside, more vehicles rushed past, their emergency lights painting the walls of the community center in red and blue flashes that made everything feel urgent and unreal. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the sound of engines and sirens, I could hear the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors heading toward whatever crisis was big enough to pull me back into the world I'd worked so hard to escape. The emergency alert on my phone updated with new information, and as I read the words, I felt my civilian identity crack completely. Major infrastructure failure reported. Multiple casualties. Emergency personnel report to designated staging areas immediately.
My family was still staring at me, waiting for me to answer the phone that had been ringing for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. In their faces, I could see the beginning of understanding that their anxious, overly prepared relative might not be who they thought she was. And as I finally raised the phone to my ear and heard the familiar voice of emergency command asking for Major Davis, I realized that there was no going back to being just Sarah anymore. Not tonight, and maybe not ever again. "Major Davis, we have a situation," the voice on the phone said without preamble. Regional Emergency Coordinator Williams sounded like he'd been awake for 36 hours straight, which, knowing Williams, he probably had been. "The Riverside Dam is showing structural compromise after the earthquake. We're looking at potential catastrophic failure within the next 4 to 6 hours. My blood turned to ice water. The Riverside Dam sat 12 miles upstream from Cedar Falls, holding back millions of gallons of water that would turn our quiet town into a death trap if the structure failed. I'd studied that dam during my initial assessment of regional vulnerabilities when I'd first moved here, and I knew exactly what catastrophic failure would mean for everyone I cared about. "What's the current threat level?" I asked, my voice automatically shifting into the crisp, professional tone that my family had never heard before. "Level 4 and climbing. We've got engineering teams on site, but the access road took damage in the quake. We need someone who knows the area to coordinate civilian evacuation while we figure out if we can stabilize the structure." I was already moving, my civilian brain shutting down as operational thinking took over. Through the red emergency lighting, I could see my family watching me with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning comprehension, but they felt distant now, like figures in a photograph rather than real people standing 3 feet away. "How many people are we looking at for evacuation?" I asked, pulling up mental maps of the flood zone that would result from dam failure. "Approximately 8,000 residents in the primary impact zone, another 3,000 in secondary flooding areas. We're setting up command of the Cedar Falls High School gymnasium. How soon can you be there?" 8,000 people. The number hit me like a physical blow, because these weren't statistics on a briefing sheet. These were my neighbors, my community, people who shopped at the same grocery store and attended the same 4th of July barbecues. People who had no idea that their sleepy little town was about to face the kind of disaster that would reshape their lives forever. 20 minutes, I replied, already calculating routes and resources. "Has anyone activated the emergency broadcast system?" "Working on it. The earthquake damaged some transmission equipment, so we're dealing with communication gaps. That's why we need boots on the ground." I ended the call and looked up to find my entire family staring at me in absolute silence. The casual atmosphere of our preparedness meeting had evaporated, replaced by something electric and urgent that seemed to charge the air around us. "Sarah," my mother said slowly, her voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. "Who was that?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from Williams containing coordinates, contact information, and a preliminary evacuation map. The map showed Cedar Falls colored in different shades of red, indicating flood risk zones, and I felt sick when I realized that my parents' house sat squarely in the highest risk area. "We need to leave," I said, standing up and grabbing my notebook. "All of us, right now." "Leave?" Uncle Pete's voice cracked slightly. "Sarah, what's going on? Who were you talking to?" I looked at their faces, these people I loved who were still trying to process what they'd just witnessed, and realized that there was no gentle way to explain what was about to happen. No way to ease them into the reality that the emergency preparedness meeting they'd been treating as a casual family gathering had just become terrifyingly relevant. "The Riverside Dam," I said, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. "We have maybe 6 hours before it collapses completely. When it does, most of Cedar Falls will be underwater." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my family's faces as they processed the information, watched the moment when abstract disaster planning became concrete, immediate threat. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dams don't just fail. There are safety systems, inspections, backup plans." "Infrastructure fails," I replied, already moving toward the door. "Especially aging infrastructure subjected to seismic events beyond its design parameters." The Riverside Dam was built in 1962 with engineering standards that are obsolete by modern risk assessment. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake in the right location could absolutely compromise its structural integrity. Janet was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. How do you know all this?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
How do you know about the dam's construction date and design standards? The question hung in the air as another convoy of emergency vehicles roared past outside, their sirens wailing through the night. I could see more headlights in the distance, a steady stream of official vehicles heading toward what I knew would be the incident command post being established at the high school. Because, I said, my carefully maintained civilian identity finally cracking completely, it's my job to know these things. Before anyone could ask the obvious follow-up question, the community center's main door burst open and 3 figures in official jackets strode in, their flashlight beams cutting through the red emergency lighting. The lead figure was a woman about my age with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "Excuse me," she called out, sweeping her flashlight across our group. "Is there a Sarah Davis here? We're looking for Major Sarah Davis." The blood drained from my face as my worst nightmare played out in front of my family. I'd spent 5 years carefully separating my professional life from my personal life, 5 years being just Sarah the librarian when I came home to Cedar Falls, 5 years hiding the fact that Major Sarah Davis was one of the most experienced disaster response coordinators in the Pacific Northwest. "That would be me," I said quietly, stepping forward into the beam of her flashlight. The woman's posture changed immediately, shifting from official authority to something approaching relief. "Major Davis, thank God. I'm Regional Coordinator Jennifer Chen, FEMA Region 10. We've been trying to reach you through normal channels, but communications are compromised. We need you to take point on civilian evacuation coordination." I heard my mother make a small sound behind me, something between a gasp and a whimper. When I glanced back, I could see my family staring at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head. The confusion in their faces was painful to witness because I could see them trying to reconcile the Sarah they knew with the person the FEMA coordinator was addressing. "What's the current status?" I asked Chen, my professional training overriding the emotional chaos of my personal world colliding with my work life. "Engineering assessment shows progressive failure in the dam's western section. The earthquake opened fractures in the concrete that are widening under hydrostatic pressure. We've got maybe 4 hours before containment becomes impossible." 4 hours. The timeline had compressed, which meant we were looking at a mass evacuation under emergency conditions rather than the methodical relocation I'd been hoping for. I could feel my family's eyes on me as I processed the tactical situation, their confusion and shock radiating like heat. "Have you established evacuation routes?" I asked. "That's why we need you. You know this area better than anyone on our current team. We need someone who understands local infrastructure limitations and can coordinate with community leaders." I nodded, my mind already shifting into operational mode. "Highway 18 will be our primary route until the rain starts. Then we'll need to shift traffic to Cedar Creek Road. We'll need to establish traffic control points at the elementary school and the fire station to manage flow rates and prevent bottlenecks." Chen was taking notes, but I could feel my family behind me absorbing every word, hearing me speak a language they'd never known I was fluent in. The technical terminology, the assumption of authority, the casual familiarity with emergency protocols that revealed years of experience they'd never suspected. "Sarah," my father's voice was quiet, almost wondering, "What is this? What are you?" I turned to face them, these people who'd known me my entire life but apparently hadn't known me at all. In the red emergency lighting, their faces looked strange and unfamiliar, like I was seeing them through new eyes. "I'm a disaster response specialist," I said, the words feeling both foreign and natural in my mouth. "I hold the rank of Major in the Army Reserve, assigned to FEMA Region 10 for emergency response coordination. I've been doing this for 15 years.
The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Chen's radio crackling with updates from the dam site. My family stared at me like I was a stranger who'd somehow taken the place of their daughter, sister, aunt. I could see them trying to process not just what I'd told them, but what it meant about everything they thought they knew about me. 15 years? My mother whispered. But you're a librarian. You work at the library part-time. The library job is my cover, I said, hating how that sounded even as I said it. It gives me flexibility to respond to emergencies while maintaining residence in a community I'm responsible for protecting. Uncle Pete was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. You mean all those times you were worried about earthquakes and floods and emergency supplies, you weren't being paranoid? You actually knew what you were talking about. I've responded to disasters across 3 states, I said. Earthquakes, floods, wildfires, industrial accidents. I know what happens when communities aren't prepared, and I know what it takes to save lives when infrastructure fails. Brandon was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and betrayal. All those times you tried to tell us about emergency preparedness, about having backup plans and supplies, you were trying to save our lives. I was trying to protect you without scaring you, I admitted. I wanted you to be prepared without having to know why I was so certain that preparation was necessary. Ashley had pulled out her phone and was typing frantically. Major Sarah Davis, she read from her screen, her voice getting higher with each word. Coordinated earthquake response in Southern California, flood management in Northern Idaho, wildfire evacuation in Eastern Oregon. Sarah, you're famous. There are news articles about you. There are pictures of you in uniform standing in front of disaster sites. The weight of my hidden life crashed over me as I watched my family discover who I really was through internet searches and FEMA coordinators rather than through my own words. I'd wanted to protect them from the reality of my work, from the knowledge of how fragile our normal lives really were. But instead, I'd created a situation where they were learning the truth in the worst possible way. Major Davis, Chen interrupted, her radio crackling with urgent updates. We're getting reports of increased seepage at the dam site. We need to initiate evacuation procedures immediately. I looked at my family, at their faces full of questions I didn't have time to answer, and felt the familiar weight of command settling over my shoulders. There would be time later for explanations and apologies and trying to rebuild the relationships that my deception had damaged. Right now, there were 8,000 people whose lives depended on me doing my job. Chen, I need you to establish check-in stations at the high school and the community college, I said. We'll need medical triage, family reunification, and temporary shelter coordination.
How many personnel do we have on the ground? 12 FEMA coordinators, 6 National Guard units, and whatever local resources we can mobilize. It wasn't enough. It was never enough, but it was what we had to work with. I could feel my family watching me as I shifted into command mode, seeing a version of myself they'd never witnessed before. We'll need to supplement with local volunteers, I said. I know this community. I can identify people with relevant skills and experience. I turned to my family, seeing them through professional eyes for the first time. My father had been a volunteer firefighter for 20 years before retiring. Uncle Pete had managed logistics for a trucking company. Aunt Caroline was a retired nurse. Marcus had project management experience. Even the twins had skills that could be useful in an evacuation scenario. All of you, I said, my voice carrying command authority that made them straighten instinctively. I need you to help me save this town. My mother's face was pale in the emergency lighting, but I could see something shifting in her expression. The worried mother being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that her daughter wasn't having an anxiety attack about disaster preparedness. Her daughter was the expert who other experts called when disasters actually happened. "Tell us what to do," she said simply. Before I could respond, Chen's radio erupted with urgent chatter. All units, we have accelerated failure at the dam site. Estimate complete structural collapse within 90 minutes. Repeat, 90 minutes to catastrophic failure.
90 minutes. The timeline had compressed again, turning an already challenging evacuation into something approaching impossible. I felt the familiar calm that always descended over me when situations became truly critical, the operational mindset that allowed me to function when other people froze. Chen, get on the emergency broadcast system and initiate immediate evacuation of zones 1 through 4. Use the high school as primary staging, the community college as secondary. All coordinate door-to-door in the residential areas. I turned to my family, seeing them as resources now rather than relatives. Dad, I need you to organize traffic control at the elementary school intersection. Pete, you're handling vehicle coordination at the high school parking lot. Caroline, medical triage setup. Marcus, family reunification and missing persons tracking. They were all staring at me with expressions that mixed shock with something approaching pride. I realized they were seeing me as I actually was for the first time in their lives, seeing the person I'd trained to become rather than the person I'd pretended to be. "What about us?" Ashley asked, gesturing to herself and Brandon. "Social media coordination," I said without hesitation. "Get on every platform and start spreading evacuation information. Use your networks to reach people who might not have gotten official alerts. You know this community better than any official communication system." They nodded, their teenage skepticism replaced by focused determination. I watched them transform from kids attending a boring family meeting into young adults with important responsibilities, and felt a complicated mixture of pride and regret that it had taken a disaster to show them who I really was. Chen was already coordinating with her team, but she turned back to me with a question in her eyes. "Major, what about your family? Shouldn't they be evacuating rather than helping with response?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it forced me to confront the central conflict of my situation. As a disaster response professional, I should be getting my family to safety. As someone who knew how many lives hung in the balance, I couldn't afford to take experienced hands out of the operation. "They're adults," I said finally. "They can make their own choices about acceptable risk." My mother reached out and touched my arm, her fingers gentle on my sleeve. "Sweetheart, we're not going anywhere. This is our community too." I looked around at my family, at these people who'd spent the evening dismissing my expertise and were now volunteering to risk their lives because they trusted me to know what needed to be done. The irony wasn't lost on me, but there wasn't time to process the emotional complexity of the situation. "All right," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos building around us. "Let's go save Cedar Falls." As we prepared to leave the community center, I caught a glimpse of myself in the dark windows, red emergency lighting reflecting off glass. For just a moment, I saw both versions of myself superimposed, Sarah the librarian and Major Davis the disaster response expert, finally existing in the same space at the same time. Outside, the convoy of emergency vehicles had grown into a steady stream of official response, and I could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching the dam site. The night air carried the smell of diesel exhaust and that particular electric tension that always preceded major emergency operations. My family gathered around me in the parking lot, their faces illuminated by the headlights of Chen's response vehicle. In their expressions, I could see the questions they wanted to ask and the conversations we'd need to have if we all survived the next few hours. But those conversations would have to wait, because right now, Major Sarah Davis had a town to evacuate and lives to save. And for the first time in 5 years, she didn't have to pretend to be anyone else. The evacuation of Cedar Falls unfolded with the controlled chaos that I'd witnessed in dozens of emergency operations. But this time felt different because every face in the crowd belonged to someone I knew. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store clutched her elderly cat while arguing with a volunteer about leaving her inventory behind. The Kowalski family loaded their van with photo albums and legal documents, their teenage daughter crying because she couldn't find their other cat. Jim Morrison, who'd taught me algebra in high school, stood in his driveway looking lost and confused, while his son tried to convince him that yes, they really did need to leave their house behind. I coordinated the evacuation from the mobile command unit Chen had established in the high school parking lot, my radio crackling with constant updates from teams spread across the flood zone. The controlled professional chaos felt familiar, but watching my neighbors' lives get packed into whatever vehicles they could find made everything intensely personal in a way that my previous assignments had never been. "Major Davis, we've got a problem in Sector 7, came the voice through my headset. "Family of 4 refusing to evacuate. They're saying the government doesn't have the right to force them from their property." I closed my eyes briefly, recognizing the address before the coordinator even gave it to me. The Brennan family lived in a small farmhouse that would be directly in the path of the initial flood surge when the dam failed. Tom Brennan was a stubborn man with strong opinions about government overreach, and his wife Lisa was 8 months pregnant with their 3rd child. "I'll handle it," I said into the radio, then turned to Chen.
I know them. Sometimes evacuation resistance requires a personal touch. The drive to the Brennan farm took me through streets I'd walked as a child, past houses where I'd trick-or-treated, and yards where I'd played capture the flag during neighborhood barbecues. Emergency vehicles lined the roads, their flashing lights casting everything in surreal red and blue strobes that made the familiar landscape look like something from another planet. The Brennan farmhouse sat on a small rise overlooking Cedar Creek, which would become a raging torrent when the dam released its contents. Tom's pickup truck was still in the driveway, and I could see lights burning in the kitchen windows despite the power outage affecting most of the town. I knocked on their front door, hearing familiar voices inside discussing whether they should answer. When Tom finally opened the door, his expression shifted from defensive anger to surprise as he recognized me. "Sarah Davis? What are you doing here dressed like that?" I looked down at my FEMA jacket and realized that Tom had never seen me in anything but civilian clothes. To him, I was still the quiet librarian who sometimes helped his kids find books for school reports. "Tom, I need you and Lisa to pack essential items and evacuate immediately," I said, keeping my voice calm but authoritative. "The dam is going to fail within the next hour, and this area will be completely underwater." He studied my face for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, skepticism, and something approaching recognition. "Sarah, what's going on? Why are you dressed like government?" "Because I am government," I said simply. "I'm Major Sarah Davis, FEMA Region 10. I coordinate disaster response operations, and I'm telling you that if you don't leave now, your family is going to die tonight." The blunt statement hit him like a physical blow, and I could see him trying to process the disconnect between the Sarah he knew and the person standing on his doorstep giving him evacuation orders. "You're serious," he said slowly. "This isn't some drill or government fear-mongering? You really think the dam is going to fail?" "I don't think it," I replied. "I know it. I've seen the engineering assessments, the stress analyses, the real-time monitoring data. The western section of the dam has stress fractures that are widening under hydrostatic pressure. When it goes, this valley is going to become a lake, and everyone who's still here is going to drown." Lisa appeared behind Tom, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. "Sarah? Tom, why is Sarah wearing a FEMA jacket?" "Because she works for them," Tom said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Lisa, she's not just the librarian. She's some kind of emergency response expert." I could see Lisa processing this information, her eyes moving from my official jacket to my radio to the government vehicle parked in their driveway. "How long have you been doing this?" 15 years, I said. "I've been living in Cedar Falls for 5 years, monitoring regional disaster risks and maintaining emergency preparedness protocols. The library job gives me community integration and flexibility to respond when situations develop." Tom was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. "All those times you came to community meetings and talked about earthquake preparedness and flood insurance, you weren't just being paranoid. I was trying to keep this community alive," I said. "I knew this day would come eventually. I just hoped I'd have more time to prepare everyone." Lisa's face crumpled, and I could see the weight of realization hitting her. "We're really going to lose everything, aren't we? The farm, the house, everything Tom's family built here." The pain in her voice cut through my professional detachment because I knew exactly what they were losing.
The Brennan farm had been in Tom's family for 4 generations, and they were about to watch it disappear under millions of gallons of water, released by a dam that had been built before proper environmental impact assessments existed. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in years. "But you can rebuild a farm. You can't rebuild your lives if you're dead." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley that his great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1923. Then he nodded. Decision made. "How long do we have?" 30 minutes, maybe less," I said, checking my watch. "Pack documents, medications, emergency supplies. Leave everything else." As they moved through their house gathering essentials, I stood on their porch watching the lights of other evacuating families moving through the darkness like fireflies. My radio crackled with updates from other sectors, coordinators reporting successful evacuations mixed with growing urgency about the dam's deteriorating condition. "Major Davis," came Chen's voice through my headset, "engineering reports complete structural failure is imminent. We need all personnel to pull back to safe zones immediately." I looked at the Brennan house, where Tom and Lisa were loading their children into car seats with the careful precision of people who understood that this might be the last normal thing they did for a very long time. Their 8-year-old son kept asking why they couldn't take his bicycle, and their 6-year-old daughter was crying because they couldn't find her stuffed elephant. "Sector 7 evacuation complete in 5 minutes," I responded. "The Brennan family is mobile." As we formed a small convoy leaving the farm, I caught a glimpse of Tom in my rearview mirror, stopping his truck at the end of his driveway for one last look at the house where he'd been born. The moment felt heavy with the weight of loss and change, but also with the relief of lives saved by knowledge that most people never wanted to think about. The high school parking lot had transformed into a disaster relief staging area that would have impressed my instructors at the Emergency Management Institute. My family had taken their assignments seriously, creating organizational systems that turned potential chaos into manageable operations. My father had established traffic flow patterns that prevented bottlenecks, while Uncle Pete coordinated vehicle logistics with the efficiency of someone who understood how to move resources under pressure. Aunt Caroline had set up a medical triage station that looked professional enough to handle serious emergencies, and Marcus had created a family reunification system using whiteboards and volunteer coordinators that was actually more efficient than some of the computer-based systems I'd seen in other operations. But it was Ashley and Brandon who impressed me most. They'd used their social media networks to create a real-time communication system that reached people who'd missed official alerts, coordinated ride-sharing for families without transportation, and even established a lost pet reunification network that was helping people find animals that had scattered during the evacuation chaos. "Aunt Sarah," Ashley called out as I approached the command station, "we've been tracking evacuation numbers on Instagram and Facebook. We think we've reached about 90% of the affected population." 90% was excellent for a rapid evacuation under emergency conditions, but 10% of 8,000 people still meant 800 individuals who are either missing or choosing to ignore evacuation orders. 800 people who would die if I couldn't find them and convince them to leave in the next 20 minutes. The blunt statement hit him like a physical blow, and I could see him trying to process the disconnect between the Sarah he knew and the person standing on his doorstep giving him evacuation orders. "You're serious," he said slowly. "This isn't some drill or government fear-mongering? You really think the dam is going to fail?" "I don't think it," I replied. "I know it. I've seen the engineering assessments, the stress analyses, the real-time monitoring data. The western section of the dam has stress fractures that are widening under hydrostatic pressure. When it goes, this valley is going to become a lake, and everyone who's still here is going to drown." Lisa appeared behind Tom, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her face pale with exhaustion and worry. "Sarah? Tom, why is Sarah wearing a FEMA jacket?" "Because she works for them," Tom said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "Lisa, she's not just the librarian. She's some kind of emergency response expert." I could see Lisa processing this information, her eyes moving from my official jacket to my radio to the government vehicle parked in their driveway. "How long have you been doing this?" 15 years, I said. I've been living in Cedar Falls for 5 years, monitoring regional disaster risks and maintaining emergency preparedness protocols. The library job gives me community integration and flexibility to respond when situations develop. Tom was shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. All those times you came to community meetings and talked about earthquake preparedness and flood insurance, you weren't just being paranoid. I was trying to keep this community alive, I said. I knew this day would come eventually. I just hoped I'd have more time to prepare everyone. Lisa's face crumpled, and I could see the weight of realization hitting her. We're really going to lose everything, aren't we? The farm, the house, everything Tom's family built here. The pain in her voice cut through my professional detachment because I knew exactly what they were losing. The Brennan farm had been in Tom's family for 4 generations, and they were about to watch it disappear under millions of gallons of water released by a dam that had been built before proper environmental impact assessments existed. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in years. But you can rebuild a farm. You can't rebuild your lives if you're dead. Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley that his great-grandfather had homesteaded in 1923. Then he nodded. Decision made. How long do we have? 30 minutes, maybe less, I said, checking my watch. Pack documents, medications, emergency supplies. Leave everything else. As they moved through their house gathering essentials, I stood on their porch watching the lights of other evacuating families moving through the darkness like fireflies. My radio crackled with updates from other sectors. Coordinators reporting successful evacuations mixed with growing urgency about the dam's deteriorating condition. Major Davis, came Chen's voice through my headset.
Who's still out there? I asked, looking at their improvised tracking system. Mostly elderly residents who don't use social media and some of the more isolated rural properties, Brandon said, consulting his phone. We've got volunteers doing door-to-door checks, but there are still gaps in coverage. I studied their coordination system, recognizing the kind of comprehensive community outreach that took years to develop properly. My teenage niece and nephew had created in 2 hours what most emergency management agencies struggled to implement in 2 years. How did you learn to do this? I asked, gesturing at their organizational setup. Ashley looked surprised by the question. You taught us, she said simply. All those times you talked about communication networks and community connections, we were listening. We just didn't realize you were teaching us disaster response protocols. The realization hit me like a physical blow. For 5 years, I'd been unconsciously training my family and community for exactly this situation. Every conversation about emergency preparedness, every suggestion about backup communication plans, every seemingly paranoid observation about infrastructure vulnerabilities had been building toward this moment. Major Davis, Chen's voice cut through my thoughts as she approached with her radio in hand. We're getting readings that indicate imminent catastrophic failure. We need to initiate final evacuation protocols immediately. I looked around the high school parking lot at the hundreds of families who'd trusted me enough to leave their homes based on my assessment of danger they couldn't see or understand. Children sleeping in back seats, elderly residents sitting in lawn chairs because standing was too difficult, families huddled together with everything they'd been able to save packed into whatever vehicles they could find. What's the status on dam site personnel? I asked. All engineering teams have been evacuated. We're monitoring remotely now, Chen replied. Latest estimates put complete failure within the next 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling over me as I realized that 800 people were about to die unless I could figure out how to reach them in the next quarter hour. Chen, I need helicopter support for final sweeps of isolated properties, I said, my mind already calculating flight times and search patterns. Negative, Major. Weather conditions are deteriorating, and we can't risk aircraft operations this close to failure time. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of tactical limitations combining with impossible timelines. This was the moment that haunted every disaster response coordinator, when you'd done everything possible within safe parameters, but people were still going to die because there wasn't enough time or resources to save everyone.
Sarah, my mother's voice broke through my professional focus as she approached with a concerned expression. Sweetheart, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. I turned to face her, this woman who'd raised me without knowing that she was preparing me for moments exactly like this. 800 people, Mom. 800 people are still out there, and I can't reach them all. She studied my face with the intuitive understanding of a mother who'd spent 35 years reading her daughter's expressions. You've saved 7,200 people tonight. That's not failure, Sarah. That's extraordinary success under impossible circumstances. The rational part of my mind knew she was right, but the part of me that had been trained to accept responsibility for every life in my operational area couldn't accept the mathematics of acceptable losses. This wasn't a foreign country where I'd never met the casualties. These were my neighbors, people whose names I knew and whose children I'd helped find library books. Major Davis, a voice called out behind me, and I turned to see Tom Brennan approaching with his pregnant wife. Sarah, we wanted to thank you before the dam goes. You saved our family tonight. Lisa nodded, her hand resting on her belly. Our baby is going to be born because you had the courage to tell us the truth. I felt something break inside me as I looked at them. This family who would have been among the first casualties if I hadn't been willing to reveal my professional identity. The weight of hidden expertise, of knowledge that people needed but didn't want to hear, suddenly felt unbearable. I should have told everyone sooner, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. I should have been open about who I was and what I knew instead of trying to protect people from uncomfortable truths. Tom shook his head firmly. Sarah, if you'd told us 5 years ago that you were some kind of government disaster expert, half the town would have thought you were crazy, and the other half would have treated you like an outsider. You wouldn't have been able to help anyone. But maybe more people would have been prepared, I said. Maybe we would have had better evacuation plans, better emergency supplies, better communication systems. Maybe, Lisa said gently, but maybe you also would have spent 5 years being treated like the crazy lady who worked for the government instead of being trusted as Sarah, who lived here and cared about the community. Before I could respond, a low rumble began to build in the distance, starting as a vibration felt in the ground rather than heard in the air. The sound grew steadily louder, becoming a deep thunder that seemed to roll across the valley like the voice of some enormous, angry god. Everyone in the parking lot stopped what they were doing and turned toward the sound, toward the darkness where the Riverside Dam had held back millions of gallons of water for 63 years. The rumble grew into a roar, and then into something beyond sound, a physical force that seemed to shake the earth itself. There it goes, Chen said quietly, her voice barely audible over the growing thunder of water rushing through a landscape that had never been designed to contain it. I checked my watch automatically, noting the exact time of failure for the after-action report I'd eventually have to write. But the numbers felt meaningless as I listened to the sound of geography being rewritten, of Cedar Creek becoming wild and powerful and destructive. The roar continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The sound of water finding its way through the valley with the unstoppable force of gravity and physics. When it finally began to fade, the silence that followed felt strange and empty, like the world holding its breath. It's done, I said, not sure if I was talking to my family or to Chen or to myself. My phone buzzed with an alert, and I looked down to see updated flood zone maps showing the water's projected path through areas that had been neighborhoods and farms just hours before. The red zones on my screen represented the complete destruction of everything those 800 missing people had ever built or loved. Sarah, Ashley's voice was quiet but urgent, we're getting reports through social media, people who made it to higher ground, people who got out at the last minute. The final count might not be as bad as we thought. I looked at her phone, seeing posts and photos from people who'd found ways to reach safety despite missing the official evacuation. Families who'd helped each other, neighbors who'd coordinated their own rescue operations, people who'd applied the disaster preparedness knowledge I'd been unconsciously teaching them for 5 years. How many? I asked. Brandon was frantically coordinating with other family members monitoring different social platforms. We're seeing check-ins from about 600 of the missing 800. People posting that they're safe, that they found ways out. 600.
The number felt like a physical weight lifting from my chest, though I knew that 200 people was still a devastating loss. But in the brutal mathematics of disaster response, losing 200 people instead of 800 represented the difference between community tragedy and community extinction. Major Davis, Chen's radio crackled with updates from the incident command post. Preliminary reports indicate successful evacuation of approximately 97% of affected population. Casualty estimates are being revised significantly downward. 97%. In any other context, those numbers would have felt insufficient, but in disaster response terms, they represented extraordinary success under emergency conditions. I'd participated in operations where 60% evacuation rates were considered acceptable. I looked around the high school parking lot at the faces of people who'd trusted me enough to leave everything behind based on my assessment of danger they couldn't see. Families huddled together in cars, elderly residents wrapped in blankets provided by volunteers, children sleeping despite the noise and confusion around them. These were the people I'd spent 5 years protecting without them knowing it. People whose lives had depended on my willingness to hide my expertise behind the comfortable facade of being just another neighbor who worried too much about disasters that would probably never happen. "Sarah," my father approached with that particular expression he got when he was trying to process something that challenged his understanding of the world. "I keep thinking about all those family gatherings where you'd mention earthquake kits and evacuation routes, and we'd all think you were being paranoid." "You weren't paranoid," Uncle Pete added, joining the conversation. "You were professional. You were doing your job, even when we didn't know it was your job." I felt the weight of 5 years of careful deception settling on my shoulders as I looked at my family's faces. They were seeing me clearly for the first time, understanding that their anxious relative had actually been one of the most qualified disaster response experts in the region. "I'm sorry I lied to you," I said, the words feeling inadequate for the complexity of what I'd hidden. "I wanted to protect you from knowing how dangerous the world really is." My mother reached out and took my hand, her fingers gentle and warm despite the chaos surrounding us. "Sweetheart, you didn't lie to us. You protected us. There's a difference." "But I could have done more," I said. "I could have trained the community better, established better emergency protocols, made sure everyone was properly prepared instead of trying to slip disaster preparedness into casual conversation." "You could have," Aunt Praline said thoughtfully, "but then you would have been the government expert trying to tell people what to do instead of Sarah who lived here and cared about us. Trust works differently when it's personal." I looked around at the evacuation site my family had helped create, at the organizational systems they'd implemented using knowledge I'd shared without them realizing they were learning professional disaster response protocols. In trying to hide my expertise, I'd accidentally created a network of trained community responders who understood emergency management principles because they'd learned them from someone they trusted. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "I mean, after tonight, do you go back to being Sarah the librarian, or do we all pretend this never happened?" The question hung in the air as emergency vehicles continued their work around us, and families settled in for what would be a long night of displacement and uncertainty. I realized that I'd been so focused on hiding my professional identity that I'd never considered what would happen if it was revealed. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've never been both Sarah and Major Davis in the same place before." Brandon looked up from his phone with a strange expression. "Aunt Sarah, you're trending on social media. People are posting about the librarian who saved Cedar Falls. There are photos of you coordinating evacuations, videos of you giving orders to FEMA personnel." The realization that my hidden identity was becoming public knowledge should have terrified me, but instead I felt something approaching relief. After 5 years of carefully maintaining separate lives, the exhausting work of pretending to be someone I wasn't was finally over. "Good," I said, surprising myself with how natural the word felt. "Maybe it's time people know who I really am."
Ashley showed me her phone screen where dozens of posts were sharing the story of the community member who'd turned out to be a disaster response expert. People were connecting my years of emergency preparedness advocacy with my revealed professional expertise, understanding for the first time that my seemingly paranoid observations had been based on actual knowledge rather than anxiety. "They're calling you a hero," she said. "I'm not a hero," I replied automatically. "I'm just someone who was trained to do a job." "Sarah," my mother's voice carried the gentle firmness I remembered from childhood. "Maybe it's time you stopped deciding what other people are allowed to know about who you are." The words hit me with unexpected force because they highlighted something I'd never fully acknowledged about my decision to hide my professional identity. I'd been so focused on protecting my family from uncomfortable truths that I'd never given them the chance to decide for themselves whether they wanted to know those truths. "You're right," I said, feeling something shift inside me as I accepted the reality of my exposed identity. "I should have trusted you to handle knowing who I really was." Tom Brennan had been listening to our conversation, and he stepped forward with the serious expression of someone who'd spent the evening reevaluating everything he thought he knew about his community. "Sarah, speaking for everyone whose life you saved tonight, I'm glad you were here. I'm glad you knew what you knew, and I'm glad you were willing to use that knowledge to protect us, even if it meant revealing secrets you'd been keeping." I looked around at the faces surrounding me. These people who'd discovered that their quiet, overly cautious neighbor was actually one of the most experienced disaster response coordinators in the Pacific Northwest. In their expressions, I could see acceptance rather than betrayal, gratitude rather than anger at being deceived. "What's going to happen to Cedar Falls?" Lisa asked, her hand resting on her belly as she contemplated raising a child in a community that had just lost a significant portion of its infrastructure. "We rebuild," I said without hesitation. "We use what we learned tonight to build back better with proper flood management and emergency preparedness systems. We turn this disaster into an opportunity to create a community that's actually prepared for the next emergency." "And you'll help us?" Tom asked. I looked at my family, at my neighbors, at the community that had just discovered my professional identity under the worst possible circumstances. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't have to choose between being Sarah the librarian and Major Davis the disaster expert. "I'll help you," I said, both as someone who lives here and cares about this place, and as someone who knows how to build communities that can survive disasters. The eastern sky was beginning to show the faint gray light that preceded dawn, and I realized that we'd spent the entire night managing the evacuation and immediate response. In a few hours, the full scope of the flood damage would become visible, and the long work of recovery would begin. But for now, there was just the quiet satisfaction of lives saved and truths finally told. I was no longer Sarah the librarian who worried too much about disasters that would probably never happen. I was no longer Major Davis who had to hide her expertise behind civilian cover. I was both, finally and completely, in the same place at the same time. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt exactly right. 6 months later, the community center looked exactly the same as it had on that October night when everything changed, except now everyone who walked through those doors knew exactly who I was. The monthly Cedar Falls emergency preparedness meetings had grown from 12 skeptical family members to nearly 200 community members who came prepared with notebooks, questions, and a respect for disaster planning that had been earned through experience rather than imposed through fear. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "I mean, after tonight, do you go back to being Sarah the librarian, or do we all pretend this never happened?" The question hung in the air as emergency vehicles continued their work around us, and families settled in for what would be a long night of displacement and uncertainty. I realized that I'd been so focused on hiding my professional identity that I'd never considered what would happen if it was revealed. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've never been both Sarah and Major Davis in the same place before." Brandon looked up from his phone with a strange expression. "Aunt Sarah, you're trending on social media. People are posting about the librarian who saved Cedar Falls. There are photos of you coordinating evacuations, videos of you giving orders to FEMA personnel." The realization that my hidden identity was becoming public knowledge should have terrified me, but instead I felt something approaching relief. After 5 years of carefully maintaining separate lives, the exhausting work of pretending to be someone I wasn't was finally over. "Good," I said, surprising myself with how natural the word felt. "Maybe it's time people know who I really am." Ashley showed me her phone screen, where dozens of posts were sharing the story of the community member who'd turned out to be a disaster response expert. People were connecting my years of emergency preparedness advocacy with my revealed professional expertise, understanding for the first time that my seemingly paranoid observations had been based on actual knowledge rather than anxiety. "They're calling you a hero," she said. "I'm not a hero," I replied automatically. "I'm just someone who was trained to do a job." "Sarah," my mother's voice carried the gentle firmness I remembered from childhood. "Maybe it's time you stopped deciding what other people are allowed to know about who you are." The words hit me with unexpected force because they highlighted something I'd never fully acknowledged. I stood at the same makeshift podium where Marcus had once shuffled through internet printouts, but now I wore my uniform openly, and the materials I presented came from 15 years of professional experience rather than last-minute research. The difference wasn't lost on anyone in the room, especially my family members, who sat in the front row with expressions that still carried traces of wonder whenever they watched me work. "Tonight, we're covering winter storm protocols," I announced to the assembled crowd. "As most of you learned during the December ice storm, power outages can extend well beyond the 3-day supply recommendations that used to seem excessive." I caught Tom Brennan's eye as he raised his hand from the middle of the room. His family had been living in temporary housing since the flood, but they'd chosen to rebuild on higher ground rather than relocate entirely. The experience of losing everything had transformed him from someone who resisted government oversight into one of my most dedicated volunteer coordinators. "Major Davis, question about backup heating systems," he said, using the title that still sounded strange coming from people who'd known me as just Sarah for years. "We're looking at installing a wood stove in the new house, but Lisa's concerned about carbon monoxide safety with the new baby." I smiled at the mention of their daughter, born 3 weeks after the flood in the temporary medical facility we'd established at the community college. Little Emma Brennan had become something of a symbol for the community's renewal, proof that life continued even after disaster reshaped everything familiar. "Wood stoves are excellent backup heating, but you'll need proper ventilation and carbon monoxide detectors with battery backup," I replied. "I can connect you with certified installers who understand emergency heating safety protocols." The questions that followed showed how much the community had learned since that night when people thought 3 days of supplies would be sufficient for any emergency. Now they asked about generator maintenance, medical supply rotation, communication redundancy, and water purification systems with the seriousness of people who understood that preparation wasn't paranoia, but survival. After the meeting ended, I found myself standing in the parking lot with my family, watching people discuss emergency plans with the casual competence of individuals who'd lived through real disaster. The transformation still amazed me, how quickly a community could adapt when they understood that knowledge wasn't theoretical but essential. "You know what's funny?" Ashley said, leaning against her car while scrolling through her phone. "Before the flood, I thought emergency preparedness was something weird people did because they watched too much news. Now all my friends text me for advice about emergency kits." She'd become something of a social media expert on disaster communication, running the town's emergency alert systems through platforms that reached demographics traditional warning systems missed. Her teenage networks had proven more effective than official channels during the ice storm, when power outages knocked out traditional emergency broadcasts. "That's because you understand the difference between being prepared and being scared," I said. "Preparation is empowering. Fear is paralyzing." Brandon nodded from where he sat in the driver's seat, his National Guard uniform visible through the open car door. He'd accelerated his military timeline after seeing my work during the flood, and now split his time between college classes and emergency response training. "I never realized how much you were teaching us all those years," he said. "All those conversations about backup plans and emergency supplies that we thought were just you being worried about everything." My mother approached with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to move carefully since breaking her hip during the evacuation. The injury had been minor compared to what could have happened, but it had reinforced for all of us how quickly circumstances could change from normal to life-threatening. "Sarah, dear, Mrs. Chen stopped by the library today," she said, referring to the regional FEMA coordinator who'd become a regular presence in Cedar Falls. "She wanted to know if you'd consider taking the permanent position as Community Emergency Manager." The offer had been on the table for months, a formal recognition of work I'd been doing informally since the flood. It would mean giving up the pretense of being a part-time librarian and accepting a role that acknowledged my professional expertise openly. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that decision was yours to make, but that this community needs someone who understands both emergency management and what it means to live here." I looked around the parking lot at people who'd trusted me with their lives based on knowledge they hadn't known I possessed. The weight of that trust had become comfortable over the past 6 months, no longer the burden of hidden expertise, but the satisfaction of acknowledged competence. "I'm thinking about accepting," I said, the words feeling natural rather than surprising. Uncle Pete approached with Aunt Caroline, both of them carrying the emergency supply bags that had become standard equipment for every family gathering since the flood. The sight would have seemed excessive 6 months ago. Now it seemed like common sense. "If you take the job, does that mean we get to keep having these meetings?" Pete asked with a grin. "Because I have to admit, I'm kind of enjoying being the guy who knows how to set up emergency shelters." "These meetings aren't going anywhere," I assured him. "If anything, they'll get more comprehensive. I'm working on getting federal funding for a permanent emergency operations center." The conversations continued as families slowly dispersed into the night. People who'd learned to check weather forecasts, monitor emergency alerts, and maintain supply rotations with the automatic attention that came from understanding how quickly normal life could become survival situation. As I drove home through streets that looked the same as they had before the flood, but carried the invisible infrastructure of a community that had learned to prepare for disaster, I reflected on how much had changed since that October night when my professional identity had collided with my personal life. The library still employed me part-time, but now patrons asked for disaster preparedness resources with the frequency once reserved for romance novels. Children checked out books about emergency planning alongside fairy tales. Teenagers researched career opportunities in emergency management with the same enthusiasm they'd once reserved for social media influencing. My small apartment had gained a radio room, where I maintained amateur radio contact with emergency networks across the region. The garden that had once grown tomatoes in carefully labeled containers now included medicinal plants and emergency food crops. The basement storage that neighbors had once joked about now served as a model for community emergency supply planning. The biggest change, though, was the absence of exhaustion that had defined my double life for 5 years. No more carefully monitoring every conversation for slips that might reveal professional knowledge. No more deflecting questions about why I knew so much about disaster scenarios. No more pretending that my concern for community safety was anxiety rather than expertise. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet darkness, listening to the sound of a town that had learned to sleep peacefully, not because dangers didn't exist, but because they were prepared for them. Tomorrow would bring another day of balancing library work with emergency management planning, another day of being both Sarah and Major Davis in the same space without apology or concealment. The notification sound on my phone interrupted my reflection, and I glanced down to see a text message from Chen. "New disaster response position opening in Portland. Interested in expanding your scope?" I smiled and put the phone away without responding immediately. For the first time in my adult life, I had choices to make about my career that didn't require hiding who I was or pretending to be someone else. Whether I stayed in Cedar Falls or moved to larger-scale operations, I would do so as myself, completely and without reservation. The porch light illuminated my front door as I walked toward the house that had become home in ways it never had when I was maintaining a false identity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to use my expertise in service of communities that needed protection they didn't know how to provide for themselves. But tonight, there was just the satisfaction of work well done and truth finally told, of a community that had discovered strength they didn't know they possessed and expertise they'd been learning without realizing it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.